Hello and welcome to the latest BCIS Outlook for Construction webinar. Before we start, some housekeeping. Please feel free to ask any questions you have throughout the webinar using the chat box. I'll get through as many of them as possible at the end of the session. And for those questions that we don't get around to addressing during the webinar, we'll be continuing the discussion using the BCIS LinkedIn group. The session will be recorded and also made available on BCIS. So in case you encounter any technology problems, don't worry, you'll still get the chance to watch and ask questions after the event. Also, when leading the session today, you'll be prompted to give us some feedback on the event. The feedback will help us make sure that we're delivering what you want. So please do take the time to answer. Also, do let us know in the survey if you have any particular topics that you'd like us to focus on for future events. As many of you, I hope, will know, these webinars usually focus on inflation, and today's is no different. We're having a quick look at the agenda. Inflation is remaining stubbornly high. Price increases are likely to be sticky as businesses maintain price levels in some attempt to recover losses suffered as a result of the pandemic and the ongoing war in Ukraine. So the title of the webinar today is Construction Inflation, is the Worst Really Over? And to address that question, we'll examine current inflationary pressures in the construction sector, looking at forecasts of future demand levels. We'll look at our usual cost and price movements in construction through using BCIS data. But we'll also this time look at wages. Last time we looked at productivity and labour supply. This time we're going to take a sort of detailed look at wages and see if there's any real wage inflation evident. We'll then draw some conclusions and take any questions at the end. So let's take a bit of time to set the scene. I think with typically higher commodity prices and labour costs, you'd expect corporate profit margins to be squeezed and for firms to be issuing profit margin warnings, especially when the economy is stagnating. However, we don't appear to be seeing that this time. It seems that margins are being maintained or even improved in some cases. Therefore, my suspicion is that any current reduction in the cost of production is not being passed on to consumers through price cuts. And this brings us to the concept of greedflation, which has been receiving some press coverage recently, certainly over the last few weeks. And greedflation is the concept of exploiting inflation to make excessive profits. And it's basically where firms sort of keep prices high despite falling costs. And the problem with it is that it's likely to contribute to persistent inflation, which I think is what we're seeing at the moment. Although conscious that the CPI reduced by 0.1% last week. But the way it contributes to persistent inflation is that wage demands essentially increase to offset ongoing price rises. And this leads to a wage price spiral where you have a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of prices increasing and wage demands increasing at rates similar to the price rises, and attempt to sort of offset any inflationary impacts. So it's not a great place to be. And one of the things we haven't seen, and so we're sort of struggling to see any evidence of this, is our construction prices actually falling back. So we've got a question for you on the webinar. Does anyone have any recent evidence of construction prices actually falling back to their previous pre-crisis levels? It would be really interesting for us to see, and if you can submit via the chat box, that would be great. So let's look at the current inflationary drivers for construction. For this, we use a combination of BCIS and ONS data. Let's take a look at construction output data from the ONS. The chart displays total output and new work output and repair and maintenance output. And the most recent data suggests a fall in total output, which is probably a sign of things to come. The weather was blamed, I think, for the fall, but it seems more likely that recessionary pressures are starting to feed through to construction. Certainly the cost of living crisis is impacting the repair and maintenance sector, and the cost of borrowing is starting to hit the new work sector, with rising financing costs becoming a major barrier to investment. With growth in the UK economy, certainly the wider economy, expected to be subdued for the next 2 years, BCIS is forecasting construction output to fall this year and next, and that's mainly because of decreases in both housing and private commercial work. But there is a sort of bright spot on the horizon, and we expect fairly slow recovery from 2025 onwards through to the end of the forecast period in 2028. If we now take a look at new work output in a bit more detail, having seen that new work output growth was flat in the latest quarter, and our prediction is that over the year 2023 we expect new work output to fall by 6%, with no immediate prospects of recovery until 2025 at the earliest. Most of that decline will come from declining output in the housing sector. We're expecting to see some recovery later in the forecast period, but it's going to be a difficult couple of years for the housing sector. Indeed, many of the house builders and developers announced cutbacks in housing starts at the beginning of this year, and we've estimated that the housing starts will fall by about 18% in 2023 and recover slowly thereafter. But they're not likely to reach 2020 levels until around 2026. So that's a significant period of decline for the housing sector. Infrastructure output is at historically high levels, although we do predict some slowdown in growth during the forecast period. That said, there remains a robust pipeline of work, which should hopefully see output levels maintained. We expect private commercial output to fall this year as a whole. While we don't really expect to see any further dramatic declines in this sector, but likelihood is that recovery will be relatively slow. A stagnant economy is expected to mute growth for commercial space. But on the flip side of that, we've got changing environmental and working requirements, so likely to see some growth from major refurbishments in that sector. If we now take a more detailed look at the repair and maintenance sector, which has just been the engine of growth in overall output over the last few years, it's clear to see that there's some drop off in repair and maintenance output expected. We can see a start of a turn down. All sectors are predicted to stagnate over the next 12 months before a muted recovery, driven by increases in non-housing repair and maintenance work, is likely. We expect that to be driven by RAC remedial work as that comes through. But having said that, both housing R&M sectors are expected to remain pretty subdued over the forecast period, largely due to affordability issues. The existence of RAC in public buildings will require many of the affected buildings to either be rebuilt or at least have significant interventions over the next few years. And we predict that will result in increased levels of output, both in terms of repair and maintenance work, but also, depending on the size of the scheme, some likely to translate to some new work output too. So if we look at our short-term growth predictions by sector, following the latest data releases, you can see fairly clearly that public non-housing repair and maintenance is the only real bright spot, and that's predicted to grow due to increased spending as a result of RAC remedial work. We expect all other sectors to either stagnate or decline over the next 12 months. So we've seen that demand conditions look fairly muted based on the previous few slides. If we now turn our attention to building costs and tender prices, building costs as measured by the BCIS General Building Cost Index rose 2.7% in the year to third quarter 2023, and the annual rate of inflation continues to follow the downward trend from the recent peak of 14.6% in the second quarter of last year. The slowdown in the growth of construction costs is mainly attributed to the fall in material cost inflation. Having said that, the increased cost of labour is likely to be the main driver of construction costs in the near term, certainly over the next year. Overall, costs are predicted to rise by about 15% over the forecast period, which is third quarter 23 to third quarter 28. But as you can see, looking at the chart, the forecasts are certainly relatively benign compared to the recent past. If we turn our attention to tender prices, as measured by the BCIS Tender Price Index, that rose by 0.7% this quarter, third quarter, compared with the previous quarter, and by 4% on the same time last year. Looking ahead, we expect that falling demand this year and next will likely result in fewer opportunities for contractors, and therefore a greater keenness to tender. So we're forecasting tender prices to rise by about 2.1% in the year to third quarter of 2024, and by 3.6% in the third quarter of 2025. And from then on, we're expecting tender prices to rise faster than costs as recovery kicks in, with forecasting that tender prices were forecast to rise by about 18% over the 5 years to the end of the forecast period, third quarter 2028. If we now take a look at input cost inflation, see what's driving that. We can see that blue line there, material cost inflation, is continuing to fall from the peak seen in the second quarter of 2022, and they're largely driven by the remaining good availability of construction products and materials. And given the slowdown in activity and our forecast for construction output to contract over the next 2 years, we're anticipating an overall easing of materials cost growth to continue. The BCIS Materials Cost Index is forecast to grow by just 1% in the year to third quarter 2024, 1.7% in the year to third quarter 2025, and ranging between 2.5% and 2.9% in the remaining three years of the forecast period. So a significant slowdown in materials prices. Moving on to labour, labour availability and increasing labour costs continue to bring fairly strong headwinds for the construction industry, and prospects for the next year remain uncertain given wider economic uncertainties. Having said that, labour costs have taken over from materials costs as the key cost driver now. Although the growth is going to be much more subdued, we forecast it to peak at 8.3% in the first quarter of 2024. Annual growth in the labour cost index is forecast at around 6.8% in the third quarter of 2023 and 5.8% in the third quarter of 2024. So growth in labour costs is definitely now the key cost driver, although we don't expect to be anywhere near as extreme as the material cost inflation witnessed over the last couple of years. If we now take a look at the growth in construction earnings and site rates, I think, as we said at the start, it'd be interesting to see if there was any evidence of a wage price spiral in construction, and we expect to see, if there was, increasing growth in construction earnings. But according to the data we've examined, actually the growth in construction earnings seems to be easing from the midpoint of this year, according to the latest data from ONS, which is in this chart. This chart shows growth in average weekly earnings from the ONS and our own Hays BCIS site wages data. The growth in average weekly earnings was 5.8% in the second quarter of 2023. Which is actually down from 6.3% in the previous quarter. The BCIS labour cost index, which we saw on the previous slide, increased by 4.7% during the same period, which was also a fall from the previous quarter, and that's based on agreed wage awards, but also at the same time, the all-in Hays BCIS site wage cost index shows site rates rising by 4.7% in the second quarter of 2023 compared with the second quarter of 2022. So a slight increase from the 4.3% recorded in the first quarter of this year. So it seems that construction site rates, in line with inflation, are continuing to rise faster than wage awards. And the site rates are now becoming the main driver of the growth in overall costs. I think construction wage awards generally are slightly lower than site rates, and certainly the wage awards agreed earlier for 2022 and 2023 ranged anywhere between sort of 3 and 8%, and given wider inflation levels, these earnings rates don't seem to be particularly excessive. So I don't think there's certainly no evidence of a wage price spiral in the construction data that we've examined. So we thought it'd be interesting to look in a bit more detail at the site wages data, to see what sort of category was driving the uptick in the annual growth, and it seems that the two main categories are driving the annual growth in the Hays BCIS site wage index, and they're plant operatives at plus 8.1% on an annual basis, and unskilled and semi-skilled labour at 8% dead. So they're the two categories that are sort of fairly sort of outliers in terms of overall wage increases, site wage increases. I think the plant operatives one is probably driven by infrastructure work, and that sector has been growing fairly consistently over the last 2 or 3 years. But if you look on rather than on an annualised basis, if you look quarterly, the picture's slightly different. It then shows that the main driver for the increase was in the improver and semi-skilled category, which registers as 8.1% growth quarter on quarter. Having said all that, certainly in the third quarter of 2022, all of the Hayes BCIS wage cost indices showed positive growth. So there's definitely evidence of growth in site wages over the period. If we now move on to look at the BCIS Market Conditions Index, certainly looks much more benign than it has in the recent past. In the third quarter of this year, the Market Conditions Index is forecast to decline by 1.3% compared to the previous quarter, resulting in a fall of about 1.2% compared with the year earlier. When the Market Conditions Index is rising, it basically translates to prices rising faster than costs, and when it's falling, costs are rising faster than prices. And that's the position that we're currently in. Increases in site labour rates will likely push up costs ahead of prices in the first year of our forecast, before prices start to lead costs later on in the forecast. Well, having said that, looking at our MCI trend, it certainly looks that it's likely to remain relatively benign through to 2028. So we've looked at the data, and there's nothing particularly remarkable within that. But there's only so much the data can tell you, especially considering the lag in producing statistics. So we'll now sort of examine some of the comments made by members of our TPI panel at the latest meeting to get an understanding of what's happening on the ground. So we've got a few slides coming up which sort of highlight the main issues that our TPI panel members are dealing with. And in terms of procurement routes, they've noted that contractors are being much more selective on the tender routes that they're willing to work, preferably two-stage, and that's adding inflation pressure on prices. There's certainly no appetite for single-stage tendering at the moment. And another comment was that fixed-price contracts are attracting a premium. So move on to sectors, and this is obviously something that we've looked at before in terms of housing. Residential pricing heading lower due to a lack of new starts, reducing demand. There's reduced residential activity impacting the housing sector, and as a result, some contractors are looking to alternative sectors for work. So if we now look at particular pinch points, and there really is one highlighted, which is mechanical and electrical work. It is facing higher rates of inflation, much higher than general building, and as a result, projects are experiencing high M&E tender returns. So that's a main pinch point this quarter. If we move on to more inflation-specific things, certain materials that require a lot of energy during production are still experiencing relatively high inflation, such as ready-mix and precast concrete, and in addition, materials used for sustainable retrofits, such as insulating materials, electric water heaters. They're also seeing fairly high price increases. In terms of other components, steel pricing has become less volatile, but pressure has moved on to installation. This is likely to be driven by the labour shortages. Material prices are generally not being accepted by the market, so the material price increases aren't getting through. So demolition prices, which were offered a while ago, are seeing large increases due to changes in the price of scrap, red diesel, and personnel changes. And in terms of more general comments, and certainly this first one sort of harks back to what we were discussing on the very first slide, second slide, when we were setting the scene. Materials prices remain elevated, surpassing levels seen prior to the pandemic and the conflict in Ukraine. Furthermore, inflationary pressures from the labour sector are becoming more pronounced. Despite nominal wage increases, these have failed to match the rate of consumer price inflation, which is intensifying pressures as the demand for higher wages extends across the industry. And I think that encapsulates what we've seen in the previous slides. Next point is one about insolvencies. The impact of insolvencies is being felt in the market, with specific sectors experiencing more pronounced effects than others. The prolonged duration of challenging financial conditions, coupled with economic uncertainties, disruptions in supply chains and labour shortages, has led contractors to be more risk averse, particularly on bigger projects. And the final comment, in contrast, decreasing demand has triggered a certain level of capacity within the market. However, contractors are keener to bid for simpler projects. This strategic shift is driven by the aim to mitigate cash flow exposure and distribute risks in collaboration with clients. So we've seen a lot of data, had some anecdotal commentary from our TPI panel. In the next couple of slides, we'll summarise our takeaways from what we've seen so far. So, is the worst really over? I think the answer is possibly. What does the data tell us? Total output is stagnating, and future demand is forecast to soften and likely remain subdued over the next 5 years. Material cost increases have stabilised, although there's certainly no evidence of costs falling. And like my special plea at the beginning, it would be interesting to see if you have any evidence of that. Labour costs are increasing, but given the data we've looked at, they certainly appear to be within the bounds of expectations, given the wider inflationary pressures. It seems from the data that there's no evidence of a wage price spiral in construction. Although wages have increased, prices remain relatively stable. It looks as though market conditions have intervened, so slowing demand has impacted firms' ability to raise prices. So, returning to our original question, is the worst really over? I said on the previous slide, possibly. I think it's fair to say that the very worst might be. But, there's always a but. Input cost rises may be slowing. But having said that, we don't expect levels to fall from their elevated heights anytime soon. This is likely to be the new normal. Oil prices are on the rise again. This could well feed through to increased price levels in materials that are energy intensive in their production. And with winter just around the corner, this could be a problem. The cost of borrowing, although didn't increase last week. Certainly the base rate didn't increase. The cost of borrowing has increased significantly over the last year and a half. Thus, project realisation will be conditioned by investors' ability to afford the financing costs, and that's becoming a real issue, certainly for new work. So overall, I think it's a rather gloomy picture. A gloomy picture, but the very worst might be behind us. Let's end on a positive note. Okay, let's make a start on the Q&A. We've got a couple of interesting questions. Why are prices not falling? That's the first one. I think we touched on some of this earlier on in the presentation. What we're currently seeing is price growth slowing. So it's important to differentiate that from prices falling. So we're not seeing prices going down. And this could be for a number of reasons. Greedflation, which we discussed earlier, but also real inflation could actually be higher than that being measured. The other issue is that price rises tend to be sticky, and once raised, they tend to maintain their ceiling. And this was one of the reasons for me asking is if anyone had any evidence of construction prices actually falling back to their previous levels. And please, if you have, please submit them. It'll be interesting to see. The other cautionary note is that recessionary pressures that are currently building up may eventually bring some price falls, but we'll just have to watch and see how that plays out over the next few months. The next question is, do you think last week's CPI announcement and base rate decision might make a difference? Well, there's certainly better news. The CPI fall was only 0.1%, but a start in the right direction. The other factor was the core inflation was also down, which is encouraging. Sort of caveat: we'll need to watch oil price rises to see what might happen in the next round. Obviously, they've started going up again. The base rate decision is probably more significant, as mounting evidence suggests that the economy is becoming recessionary. And although the goal is to tame inflation, the Bank of England won't want to damage the economy too much in the process. It'll certainly be interesting to see how things play out over the next few months as we head towards the end of the year. Next question is about RAC. Will RAC remedial work be an inflation driver? Well, that's largely dependent on the scale of the problem, I guess. The latest count suggests that 174 schools are affected. There are still a lot of unknowns, as we don't actually know the number of buildings involved, or their size, or the condition of the rack planks. But if we assume half of that number will need total building replacement, and the other half will need new roofs, then we can arrive at an estimate of the total cost for the school estate. And we did a bit of work on this, which is, I think, now being published online on our website. But according to our estimating price data, replacing a school roof, which is, I guess, probably the most likely scenario, could cost in the region of £1 million per building. Whereas a total rebuild, that assumes that you've got rack planks in the walls as well as the roof structure. Would total rebuild come in around 5 million. So based on the number of schools currently affected, we estimate the costs could be in the region of approximately 87 million for roof replacement across the estate, and approximately 435 million for total building replacement across the estate. So that results in a total cost of about 522 million pounds, so half £500 million. And going back to the question, I think a lot of it will depend on the scheduling of the remedial work, and how that's handled. If it all comes on stream at once, then the potential increase in demand could be inflationary, particularly if there are further issues with RAC in other public sector buildings, which I think is probably very likely. The other issues, obviously, we touched on it in the last webinar, looking at capacity. There could also be issues with the capacity of the industry to service the demand. Although on the flip side, given the decline in the housing sector, there's likely to be some spare capacity available to work on the RAC remediation. But recently it's come to light that the latest news suggests that I think this is the DfE's favoured mitigation measure, essentially includes installing an additional suspended timber ceiling under the existing ceiling to catch any rack plank failures. So the predicted life of that approach is about 10 years, I think. So it's clearly only a short-term fix, and perhaps a case of postponing the inevitable. But yeah, so that's, I think, it's a rather long-winded answer to the question, but I think potentially there could be inflationary pressures building up, depending on how the work's released to the market. And another one, RAC related, could the RAC problem have been foreseen? The simple answer is yes. I think it's having said that, it is complicated, but yes, with ongoing maintenance and replacement, it certainly could have been tackled far sooner. The issues have been known about for decades, and a monitoring regime was established, but my suspicion is that many of the problems are hidden within the structure and therefore difficult to observe without either removing roof coverings or ceiling panels, and I think further complications could result given the presence of asbestos, which is still locked into school buildings built post-war. So yeah, I mean, there's strong evidence mounting from experts within both the construction industry and the education sector that this crisis could have been avoided if money had been invested in the repair and maintenance of the buildings found to contain RAC. So yeah, I think it could have been foreseen and certainly probably tackled, but I guess this is one of the failures of political systems that have 5-year election cycles. These things tend to get pushed down the road. So we're getting towards the end of our time, and while I have you here, I wanted to invite you to join us on the 5th of October at 11 a.m. Again via a free webinar for the launch of the Built Environment Carbon Database, of which the acronym is BECD. We regard it as a critical development in our attempts to combat climate change. So despite the announcements made last week, this is still high on our list of priorities. And at the event, you'll hear from industry leaders about what it is, why we developed it, and perhaps most importantly, how you can access it. So the usual joining instructions apply, and we hope to see you there. So that's the end of this quarter's webinar. Hopefully see you all towards the end of the year. Bye for now.